So welcome to Plasma 2021 on Zoom. This is a series sponsored by the Department of Media Study and the Office of the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at University of Buffalo, curated in collaboration with Liz Park from UB Art Galleries and Ekram Serdar from Squeaky Wheel. We are recording this talk, so if you don't wish to have your voice or image on the recording, please keep your camera and microphone muted. We begin with the acknowledgement that the land on which the University of Buffalo operates is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty of Peace and Friendship, a pledge to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. It is also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the United States government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. So tonight, I'm going to share my screen for a minute. Tonight, I am thrilled to introduce a cast of characters who will be in conversation. I say cast because this evening's Plasma presentation is going to be organized along the lines of an improvised performance with a 4-act structure in which each of the participants has a particular role, but no set lines. We're doing this in order to highlight some of the questions of form that our guest tonight, Gregg Bordowitz, has been considering over the course of his career as a video activist, teacher, writer, artist, performer, poet, friend, and collaborator. I say we because this evening's guest was first suggested by Liz Park, curator of exhibitions at the UB Art Galleries. And the format was conceived in a conversation between Liz, Gregg, and myself. Given Gregg Bordowitz's interests in questions, performance, and dialogue, we also thought we'd take this opportunity to address some of the meta questions that this year's Plasma series has sought to thematize. And I'll show those to you in a minute. So no public event would be complete without some sort of introduction to the guests, comprised of lists of 3 things usually: biographical information, credentials, and institutional affiliations. Following the list, introducers usually include a statement about why the speaker is important as well, offering some context for people who aren't familiar with the person to whom they are about to listen. The final touch on many introductions is the personal aside, a statement about the personal connection between the introducer host and the speaker. I'll be offering all of these for Gregg Bordowitz tonight. So we'll start with, to a great degree, introductions are comprised of lists. So that's what I'll start with. So what are Gregg Bordowitz's institutional affiliations? The professor of film, video, art, and animation, I think is the name of the department now, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and director of the Low-Residency MFA program. He's also on the faculty at the Whitney Independent Study Program, which he also attended. In terms of other institutional affiliations, working with New York's ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and several video collectives that he co-founded, he organized and documented protests against government inaction, advocating for health, education, and harm reduction. During this time, Bordowitz also created video portraits of himself and others living with AIDS, HIV/AIDS, using his quote unquote personal history as a way to tell a story shared by many. Some of these videos include Fast Trip, Long Drop, A Cloud in Trousers, The Suicide, and Habit. So that's the first list. The second list would be an institution, a list of all the venues and institutions where his work has been shown or is collected. It's too vast to mention, which is another convention of the introduction, but I'll just give you a few details, which is namely, he has a retrospective that was Gregg Bordowitz, I Want to Be Well, which was shown initially at the Art Institute of Chicago, also at the Douglas F. Cooley Memorial Art Gallery at Reed College, but is currently being installed with Gregg's help at PS1 MoMA and will open on May 13th of this year. Important to another list would be the different kinds of work that Gregg has done, including, of course, those video collective works and those individual videos. He's also worn quite a number of hats, right? Performances, produced poetry, drawings, and most recently a talk show video, a return of sorts to some of his earliest video activism and relation to public access television. He also directed and wrote an opera titled The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, by Michel Foucault, an opera, which premiered October 1st and 2nd in 2010 in Vienna, Austria. Now I've got the list of books. His book General Idea was published by After All Books in 2010. A collection of his writings, The AIDS Crisis is Ridiculous and Other Writings, 1986 to 2003, was published by MIT in the fall of 2004. He's received numerous awards from the Rockefeller, from the Guggenheim. So there's some of the list. But now I'll dismount with the personal connection. I could, of course, dismount with the 2 or 3 sentences describing his work so that you would get a sense of the value of what he's had to say and has to say tonight, being in fact tied to the content of his work, the relationship between aesthetics and politics. Especially because Gregg Bordowitz's own commitment to working across and between various modalities is precisely an investment in crossing between art and politics. To some degree, I think, I often think of the question, is culture a luxury when thinking about or talking to or in dialogue with Gregg's work? And I think that the answer that Gregg offers is complicated and is actually that culture and art are vital. But rather than just end with that kind of generalized objective-ish assessment of his value as a speaker, I'll turn to some more personal connections. First off, for me, Gregg was my professor. I chose to attend the School of the Art Institute to study with him. I've been engaged in seminars, had dinner with him, conversations, drinks. He's been an inspiration for my own work, but also for my own teaching. I have some of the fondest memories of grad school are being in Gregg's seminar when he brought in a sheet of white paper in which he'd drawn Louis Althusser's model of ideology on it. And as he explained when he put it up on the wall, that it had traveled with him semester to semester over many years. I wonder if he's got a new one now, but I teach Althusser's model of ideology every semester, and but I have no white sheet. There are 2 quotes that I'll end with from Gregg that have stuck out in my mind. The first is that he said to me, and I've heard him say in other public contexts, in the art context, when he's talking in art contexts, he emphasizes the activism of his work. And in the activist context, he emphasizes the art of his work. That was a number of years ago. He may have a different approach, but that was a very important piece of wisdom and strategy that I've taken up myself. And then finally, a model of hybrid attention to forms and containers is part of why I am so thrilled to have him here. And specifically, in order to have a conversation about media art, media artists, what is media art? What is a media artist? What is an artist talk? What is a public conversation? And why are questions important? But it isn't just Gregg who's going to be talking tonight. The next cast member in conversation with him is Liz Park, as I've already said, who is the curator of exhibitions at our own UB Art Galleries. And so I will read her bio now. And she will introduce Gregg and begin the conversation with Gregg, in part because she has initiated this conversation because she invited Gregg and has been working with him on an exhibition and a conference that will be featured at UB next fall. But Liz Park is a curator of exhibitions here. She was most recently the associate curator of the 2018 Carnegie International at Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh. She has curated exhibitions at a wide range of institutions, including the Western Front, the Kitchen, the ICA at the University of Pennsylvania, the Miller Institute for Contemporary Art at Carnegie Mellon. Her writing has been published by After All, After Image, Art Asia Pacific, Pluto Press, and Ryerson University Press, amongst many others. She was a Helena Rubinstein Fellow at the Whitney Independent Study Program in 2011 to 2012, and the Whitney Lauder Curatorial Fellow at the ICA Philadelphia between 2013 and 2015. Her research interests include mobility and migration, as well as representations of violence in the colonial present. So there are three more cast members: students played by the UB students enrolled in the Plasma course, the audience, you, the public, and Cortland Bird, a teaching assistant who I will introduce later in the evening. But just to give you a sense of what the structure of the evening is that now we will take up these 6 questions in conversation between Liz in the role of curator, Gregg in the role of artist, and myself in the role of teacher. And we will have a conversation between the 3 of us for approximately 40 minutes. Act 2 will be a break, which will be a check-in with the audience and students. And then Act 3 will be return to a round robin of questions that are based on and were posed by Plasma students and posted online today that we will put to Gregg. And then after that, Act 4 will be opening the questions for Gregg up to the audience, to the public. So, so now we're at Act 1, which will begin with the question, what is a media artist? What is media art? And I'll turn it over to Liz.
Thank you for a very thorough introduction, Paige. I also want to add my personal note, which is I witnessed Gregg speak for the first time when I was attending the Whitney Independent Study Program, and it was mesmerizing, all-encompassing, and at the same time left me in a really expansive state of thinking that wanted me to learn more and more, and at the same time dive into these questions that are so difficult to answer because we have a lot of assumptions that come with us. So what is art? What is media art, right? I guess when we are asking the question, what is a media artist? You could potentially ask, what is a media curator? And I'm not a media curator, I should say. In fact, I don't think I have a convenient label besides being a curator of contemporary art. I don't have that kind of medium specificity, but that's also interesting to consider as we are talking about media art and media artist. So maybe I'll just pitch it over to Gregg. What is media art? What is do you call yourself a media artist? Oh, you have to unmute.
Yes, I have to unmute. I've been using this platform a lot and still I forget to unmute. First, thank you both for that very warm introductions. I often think about introductions myself because as a professor and as a director of a program, I introduce people a lot. And on the one hand, everyone has mixed feelings about introductions. It's uncomfortable to be the person introduced. Most people find that. And yet, I think we persist in it because it's still very important to recognize people's accomplishments in the field. And I persist because not everyone has been recognized in that way. So I feel like it's, while I find it uncomfortable myself being introduced, when I introduce others, I still perform the convention of the introduction precisely because that honor was really only given specifically to a very narrow group of people for a very long time. And so I can't just say, oh, let's throw out that convention now in some kind of like thoughtless way. So I think the convention is very important. And I appreciate it when it's well done. And it was very honoring to be introduced by both of you. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. What is a media artist? That has changed historically as media and mediums have changed. I think of media artists as a kind of outdated term myself, although it has its uses as a certain kind of shorthand for what kind of mediums an artist might use. I think of myself as a post-medium artist, which is a kind of generational designation. The post-medium artist, the difference between media and medium is significant. Actually, they mean the same thing, but they also refer to two different things in our fields, respective fields. So media and medium are, on the one hand, are the same. They're the vehicle through which one makes one's work. Mixed media, for example, you can make a painting that has sculptural elements or uses many different materials other than paint, and you could, that on the wall label, it'll just say mixed media. Media artist tends to, in well, the United States and in Europe, to refer to someone who uses time-based mediums. But since we are now all connected, we're not all connected, but since many of us are connected through network society, and this mediation is not unusual that we're currently inhabiting, the question is, what is the media? What medium is not time-based at this juncture? Something I talk to my students who are very committed to the craft of painting, which I support. I started as a painter. I don't paint now, but I still write a great deal about painting and love painting and think about it. More people will see your painting online than they will in person. And that's significant. So it's significant only in that it poses really problems for the committed painter. For example, do you paint for the color sensibility of the screen, the laptop, or do you continue to paint pictures that are very difficult for the human eye to even see, say monochromatics or something like that. So the question of mediation is really significant, what has been increasingly significant, at least in my lifetime. Am I a media artist? Yes and no. That's my favorite answer to any question. I am and I am not a media artist. That is a logically unimpeachable statements in logic. I am and I am not, or X is and is not, is a logically unassailable question. It is absolutely true. And so I am and I am not a media artist, in that I use traditional media art. I use time-based mediums, but I also work in mediums that are not necessarily considered time-based. All of them have a presence on the web. So I'm thinking a lot about this now as I install my show, and thinking a lot about the varying ways a video artist, that's one facet of my artistic identity. How do you show videos in a museum? I've always been perplexed by that. For years, I refused actually to show my videos in museums. I only showed them if they were in screenings in museums, or if they were in festival type situations. I wouldn't put my videos on a monitor in a gallery or have them projected on a gallery wall, because I felt like creating a minor cinema was not what I was interested in with the medium. I've always been really interested in the broadcast potential of media art or video art. But all of those things got mixed together. Right, I'm just old enough to remember shooting video on 3/4 inch Portapak when there was medium specificity and artists were committed to the qualities of video versus the qualities of cinema. These things are still debated. These are very much concerns for many artists. But for me, I got to a point where I was shooting on film, transferring it to video, editing on video, not cutting celluloid. So the mediums got all mixed up for my generation. And I've never professed a fidelity to any specific medium, largely because I come out of conceptual art. However, I'm not a conceptual artist. It's not even I am and I am not a conceptual artist. I'm just not a conceptual artist. That's true. I do not, I come out of conceptual art, but actually I long ago kind of relinquished a commitment or attachment to that designation, which we can talk about. But I feel like I'm exceeding my time on the answer of the question. The question.
It's all, yeah, go ahead. It's all very fascinating.
The question of a media artist, I don't know actually what a media artist means today. I think that's why you're in a class studying media art, to actually define what that means, those terms, media, art, and what they mean when they're together.
Paige, as a professor in media art study, do you want to add anything to this conversation?
No, I think that I'm very grateful to Gregg laying it out like that. I'd like to actually hear more about this, why the post-media artist and this idea of where that comes from and your resistance, or how those terms have changed for you. What terms you do use for yourself if you're, not a media artist. But I think that the thing that you're pointing to is what this semester and teaching media art and inviting media artists to come has really introduced to the students, which is that people need to define it for themselves in terms of, and that there's so many different ways to be thinking about the role that media plays in every aspect of our lives, and mediation too, right? That these are two different frames, and that so that we actually don't have a kind of wholesale category so much as what we do is we can see this entire ecology of people having different kinds of practices, and that it's actually an important question to be asking oneself when one makes work or looks at work. What is this sort of self-definition or framework or context in which one locates oneself, right, as a legacy, which is kind of what I'm leading you towards, of asking if you want to expand on that idea of being a post-medium artist, because of this idea of how important it is to see ourselves as part of a social milieu, historical milieu, in which people have been asking these questions and coming up with different answers and different practices. So I can segue back to asking the question about the media artist, the question of your own trajectory with this idea or those definitions that you have.
Yeah, sure. And I think this relates, and I'd like to hear if Liz identifies with this as a curator, but the postmedium condition is actually a phrase that I inherited from Rosalind Krauss. I don't know if it has an earlier origin. She used it to describe the artist Marcel Bruttiers, who's an enormously influential artist and an artist I admire historically. And Bruttiers made, signs out of plastic molds. He made sculptures out of mussel shells and buckets, assemblages. He made films. And so Krauss was really interested in this kind of artist who was no longer defined by their medium. So when one says one is a post-medium artist, one's talking about a historical moment or a juncture where artists are not necessarily defined by the medium. So I'm personally, I don't sweat it in terms of what people, whatever you want me to be, just, it's fine. I show up to the poetry project and I read poems. If you think I'm a poet, that's great, because I am. I show up to a film festival and you think I'm a filmmaker, great, that I make films. I show in a gallery, I'm a gallery artist, et cetera, et cetera. For me, it's never been really interesting for me to actually, until now, thinking about the premise of a retrospective. Up until this period in my life now where I'm enjoying, actually, it's a great privilege to have a retrospective. Before that, I wasn't really trying to sum up my work, and I don't think really that's the job of the retrospective either. But the retrospective does provide this opportunity for people to see how I and other artists who, like me, who have retrospectives, was really interested in moving across fields, as Paige discussed. What I'm interested in is how, when I move from medium to medium, that there's a set of protocols that are actually more or less visible, that you can see operating within each medium. I do understand the limits and the shape and the substance of the mediums I work in, or the media, but that changes the shape, but I should be able to, or my goal is to still work within the same parameters or protocols. So that means, what that basically means, ask the similar questions or ask the same questions in a different shape through a different vehicle. I suspect, Liz, that's you as a curator, that perhaps that's why you don't have a specific designation as a media curator, because you actually have curated a great variety of mediums within your work, correct? Or?
Yeah, that is correct. And part of the reason why I issue media curator as a designation for me is because I'm a committed generalist. I go where the artists lead me. And I am interested in the ways in which artists define even the definition of media itself. So as you are talking about the different forms, shapes that your media that your work takes, you all have to chart our trajectory in the same way that media, that Paige was just talking about how all of the students in media study, or in the art department for another matter, have to define what that is for themselves. And that actually segues very well to our next question, which is, what is an artist talk? Because to me, an artist talk, similar to the way that you're talking about retrospective, a survey, exhibition of one's work, is an opportunity to reflect on your own practice, what it is that you do. And there's a very specific form to that. Of course, every artist can choose to shape it in their own way. But Gregg, I want to hear you talk about your form of an artist talk and how that's different, perhaps, compared to other opportunities in which you can talk about your work. Because not every time an artist talks is an artist talk.
That's true. That's absolutely true. I teach this stuff, and so I'll start with the principles that I teach with, because I think they're drawn from the principles that guide my notion of an artist's talk. I teach graduate students, and part of graduate school education is professional practice, but I have a very challenged relationship to the notion of professional practice, in that I don't identify with the notion of professional practice as having people perform to competence within a set of established conventions, or rather I'm interested in people performing to competence within a set of conventions, but also not letting the conventions define themselves. So in my classes, I teach a thesis presentation class for my graduate students in their third year, which is their graduating year. We look at, go online, and we look at many wraparound videos that are produced for museum shows. We look at artist talks online, as I imagine, Paige, you do in your class. We invite artists to speak, and I try to show the great variety of approaches to the notion of the artist talk, rather than, so I allow my students a lot of latitude, because one of the thresholds for graduation is doing an artist talk, but they can talk directly to the audience and describe their work. They can tell a story. They can read poetry, theirs or someone else's. In fact, there's a great deal of latitude. I'm most interested and against teaching people to conform to a certain notion of what kind of language to use, what kind of terms to use. I'm a theory head. I read a lot of theory. I'm interested in theory, but I don't think every artist has to read theory. I read theory because I love reading theory. I know a lot of artists who read theory who make bad art, and I know a lot of great artists who don't read theory. So it's not, I don't think it's necessary. Actually, I think most things I'm driven by interest, fascination, pleasure, not so much responsibility. I think responsibility is an issue for citizens. Responsibility is an issue for people engaged in sociality. I'm a responsible person, but as an artist, I've never made work out of a sense of responsibility. I didn't show up to protests. I showed up to protests with a camera because I actually love making images of protests. I never had to drag myself there. I never felt obligated. I couldn't wait to get there. I couldn't wait to make images of my friends. It's the same thing with the artist talk. I like talking. Maybe that's a kind of exhibitionist aspect of me. I don't know. There are trained professionals working on that. You don't have to bother with that. One trained professional twice a week. And the artist talk for me is a way to think out loud about my own work and to test my own assumptions about the work in dialogue with others. And I'm really interested in mobility in relationship to frames. So Paige talked about how in the art context I might do something, and in an activist context I might do something else. I am really interested in what we used to call queering the frames, or changing the frames, or demonstrating an ability to talk about my work within multiple frames of analysis. That's always been really important for me to be able to do. So if you want a Marxist frame, I can do that. If you want a feminist frame, I can do that. You want a queer theory frame, I can do that. If you want an art historical frame, for me, it's not boasting so much. I'm not boasting so much as saying that mobility has always been really important to me. And actually, I think that has to do with class, because I have a working class background, and art and going to museums was only part of my life because public schools actually funded that when I grew up in New York City. They used to, Stuart Hall used to call it the civilizing influence of art upon the working class. They used to put us into buses and take us to Manhattan from Queens, and I went queer for art. Like I think I was like not like a lot of kids were bored, but I totally went queer for art. And so I'm really interested in the artist talk in exploring my own thoughts. And the one thing that you have to do ethically, which is a matter of responsibility, is not forget that other people are listening. So I'm going to stop now because actually I've just been freely associating, which is my favorite way of modality of giving an artist talk. And but never lose sight of the fact that people are listening. And
yeah, and also this is part of a public conversation, which leads me to the next question. What exactly is a public conversation? And as I was hearing you talk about framing, Marxist frame, feminist frame, what have you, I thought maybe that is part of how we begin a public conversation. Maybe there needs to be a frame that begins a public conversation. And how is that different than a play, a performance? And I guess I want to add, like, how is a public conversation different than a private conversation? And again, my thoughts go to the frame.
Yeah, I think, well, you could say more. Of all the conditions of the presentation always precede you in the way that, often, not always, but often a baby is named before they're born. That's to create a space in language for the infant. That never goes away. The lecture hall, the classroom, this medium that we're inhabiting now, they all have preconditions, presets, defaults, expectations, and frames. And so one can apply a frame analysis, which is very important. That's a term actually that was invented by Erwin Goffman, who's a great sociologist, and the book is called Frame Analysis, and that's where I get it from. So yes, for a person like me who comes out of the institutional critique, it was always really important to point to the frame, and as actually Page demonstrated in a kind of meta introduction, or by scripting this and showing the script, this is a way of showing the frame. You don't necessarily want to defeat the frame, but you want to expand the frame or not be limited by it.
And do you have any tricks on how you prepare to answer questions?
I'm well practiced at it. I value conversation in that way. That's how I prepare for questions. I don't prepare. I prepare by not preparing. I just try to answer as honestly as I can.
And what role do questions and this type of dialogue and discourse play in your practice?
I don't think I'd have a practice without it. And my work is in dialogue. I'll go back to this notion of public and private. Even those distinctions are very difficult for me to make. I am in dialogue with people who have died, people I knew who I was close with. I'm in dialogue with artists from different centuries. I'm in dialogue with my own imagination. I don't believe I'm ever alone. I'm in my studio now, which is really just an apartment in the same building I live with my partner. When I'm alone in the studio, I feel like I'm in dialogue with many, many people. And so I don't necessarily, I always think my life is public in that way. And I don't really, I experience loneliness, but what I'm talking about is solitude. So when I'm alone and in solitude, which is actually a very exalted state, it's not loneliness. Solitude is being with oneself and engaged, and maybe even having conversations or reviewing conversations that you've had.
And are there questions you ask yourself in solitude? And do these questions change over time?
The question, I ask myself questions all the time, but I think everyone does too. I don't think of myself as special in that regard. I think the question of questions in regard to art has to do with one's investigation. I did come out of conceptual art, so I'll use those terms. Like, I think about art in some ways as a way like a scientist would approach their work, or a philosopher. That I think about the well-formed question. I think questions have consequences, meaning that there are poorly stated questions and well-stated questions. Sometimes my questions start out as poorly stated questions, but by stating them, I refine the question. This also comes out of theology. I'm deeply interested and invested in Jewish studies, and in studying the Torah, the Talmud. The question has priority over the answer. The answer is always, in an ideal world, the answer is always provisional, and it's actually the question where the art actually exists. So I prioritize the question in that way. But I did a book of questions, a book called Volition, which exists entirely of questions, and I set myself the task of sitting and writing as many questions as I could without answers on every day for a year. And there was a point where I would just exhaust questions. That I was really interested in letting go of any answers and just exhausting questions. So sometimes I'd run out of questions and just ask questions like, what's the last 4 digits of your social security number? Because I'm asked that question on a daily basis. So I work, that was an extreme example, but I work toward exhaustion with a notion of care in mind. I actually think that's important to throw in. Like, I work toward exhaustion, but I do take care of myself. I'm not interested in a kind of romantic notion of burning out, or I'm in it for the long haul. So I work toward exhaustion, but I also rest. I nap a lot.
That's good. I want to go a little off script because I actually want to pause and think about asking questions, especially for students who are always expected to ask questions, right? In every context. How do you practice asking questions? And, you talked about initially, maybe a question is clumsy or it's not a great question, but there's a process of honing in on something, the essence of what you want to ask. So maybe you can share your practice of asking questions a bit, maybe some of the process as a way to help students figure out their own way of asking questions.
Sure. I think when we talk about questions, we're talking about methodology. And by methodology, I mean the way you put things together as an artist. And so I find that how questions are more useful than why questions. So I'm more interested in how can I put these things together than why am I trying to put these things together. Why might arise, but later. I think the right question asked at the wrong time is the wrong question. So my process is to, in every project, and this is what I meant by protocols, is I give myself a period of time. If I have the luxury of time, if I'm working on deadline, I'll establish a deadline. But my first thing in order of my process is to say yes. I'm usually alone in my studio, and I'll say yes to everything. Yes, this belongs in this. This belongs in this. Yes, just say yes. And in that way, I'm operating like Freud talks about the unconscious. Sigmund Freud said in The Unconscious, the negation doesn't exist. You can fly, you know, anything you can imagine can happen. So you're kind of an id, or I'm kind of an id when I'm in my studio and I'm just saying, yes, this belongs, this belongs, this belongs, this belongs. And that way, and I'm stressing solitude here because you're not inviting any judgment in, you're trying to shed any kind of internalized judgment. You know, I feel safe, I'm not gonna show this to anybody necessarily. I'm gonna, you know, so I actually, like, an hour-long film could be a 5-hour rough cut for me. I'm trying to get to know. So I think I'm in the best position when I'm saying no. So I want to have a lot to say no to. So I'll have a 4-hour rough cut for a 1-hour program. And then, you know, because I've said yes to everything. And ideally, I stop saying yes when I can't possibly say yes anymore in good faith. There's nothing I can think of that belongs in this project. There's no more. There's nothing. It's toward exhaustion of the yes. Then, now if you're on a deadline, you can do this. Like I say, I'll say yes for 2 weeks, and I'll start saying no. And you know, next Friday, you can use this. It's very useful. And then I start saying no. This doesn't belong. This doesn't belong. This doesn't belong. And I put that like in a folder, or you know, on the desktop. It's even easier. I mean, I've been using this process for a long time, but now you just, you know, put it in the desktop, and you know, you can take whole timelines. Or in a video piece and just put the timelines away. You know, you can have multiple drafts, which I'm grateful for. And then when I'm saying no, then I'm really strict. Like, you know, but I'm, you know, that's how I find out what the piece. I'm sorry. That's how I find out what the piece is about. Because now I really have to define what it is that I want within this container, what I want within this frame. And then there's a synthesizing moment where I've said no to a lot, and then I'm like, oh, no, that can come back, or oh, I don't really need that. And then it's a back and forth, and then it's smaller navigations of the yes, no continuum. And that's a discipline. So does this belong? Does this not belong? Who's in front of the camera? Who's behind the camera? These are, you know, central questions. What falls inside the frame? What falls outside of the frame? These are very, very central questions that I ask of every work that I do. And yeah, why questions are good, but they're limiting and often inhibiting. So if I'm saying yes, if I'm in the modality of saying yes, and then I ask myself, well, why does this belong? I'm inviting my own internal censor. So that's why I do it in private, because I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to, you know, I kind of have to confront some uncomfortable things about my own assumptions, which I think is a very important aspect of making art. Art can be therapeutic, but once you call it art, it's no longer therapy. So you have to let go. Like, my work is intensely autobiographical, but everything I've put in a work of art that's autobiographical, I'm ready to let go of. I'm not a daredevil confessional artist. It's very controlled and shaped and formal. Ultimately, I'm a formalist. Yeah.
So I'm curious now to kind of ask then about the status of performance and giving and doing these videos that are performance, recorded, re-edited, and that this improvisational, right? So there's the space of your studio, the work that you make in your studio, but then how does it move into the world in public conversations like this? Or I'm just thinking that the students watched Only Idiots Smile, and you've done quite a few of performances, not artist talk necessarily, but performances too. So how do you work with that? Is that writing and heavily scripted? They feel, all of them that I've experienced feel very improvised, in the same cadence that you're talking right now, right? This associative clarity that you have. So can you describe a little of that and how that, because I mean, all of your videos have that too, the performance in front of the camera. To think about, I remember a conversation we had about Habit, your film, where you were talking about how important it was that the dyadic interview was one frame, right? Where both of you and Yvonne Rainer were in frame together. And that you were filming conversation, that it was not some kind of artifice of there not being someone else there, but that the dialogue was what you were trying to capture. So can you, in spirit of the unformed question, can you talk a little bit about that idea of performance versus this notion of the kind of tightly scripted or formalist, how performance factors into, as a formalist, how do you deal with the performative aspects of your work?
Well, there's always a set of constraints. I don't write the performances, although now I'm publishing the transcripts of my performances in the fall in a book that's going to be published by Triple Canopy. But I do develop routines in my head, and I do have go-to stories, and I know where I want to land emotionally. So with those coordinates, I can improvise a talk. I've had a lot of practice. I've started doing, in the classroom, I always think, I'm also, of this generation that read a lot of Judith Butler and the notion of the performative, and how performance is, and Irvin Goffman actually wrote a book about social performance, sociality is performance, which doesn't mean that we're all lying or we're all inauthentic or anything like that. It means that it's actually part of life to dwell in performance, and unconsciously, largely.
And his point was actually about roles, right? That there are tons of different roles that all of us play, and we know we're moving between them, right? So that it's not simply that you're false when you're playing the role of mother, right, or son, but that's a role, right? So that's part of, but sorry.
Exactly. It's the same thing here. This is very different than if we were having coffee or something like that. The roles were established, partly institutionally, partly by choice. We're here willingly. I'm very happy to be here. And but yeah, the roles precede us in the way that I talked about before, the way the name precedes the child, in a classic linguistic example. I'm very much interested in daily practice. So it took me a long time to get here. I'm 56, but I started writing every day in my 40s. I had always wanted to get to that place where I'd write every day, but I wasn't really able to until my 40s. But I wrote a lot before that. And then I got to this point where I just was able to, I had a need, actually. And I think a lot about musicians and dancers. Many of my friends are both. And this notion of daily practice and chops. So writing is a daily practice for me. Drawing has become a daily practice for me. And that gives me a lot of discipline. I have an ear for conversations. I have a pretty good memory. And so I remember pieces of conversations, and so a lot of it's playing to my strengths, or not even they're my strengths, they're like knowing myself. So actually I can't write a script and perform it over and over again. You have to have talent for that. That's a skill that I do not possess, that I have not developed. I have friends who can read the same monologue day after day in theater and differently, but produce tremendous emotions with their craft. I do not have that craft. This is what I have. I've always been a fast talker, good memory, and fast on my feet. So I tried to develop my skills with my skill set, my limited skill set. And so I remember routines, I write a lot, and sometimes I write these down, but I don't ever have a sheet of paper in front of me. Even at academic conferences, it's my preferred mode just to speak. I might have a few words. I've fooled around with this for a long time. You know, when I have to speak publicly, I don't even do this anymore, but there was years, like a decade, where I would write down the first 5 nouns that came to my head as I was on the way to the lectern. And then I would have to hit all 5 nouns or verbs. I've tried different words, different ways of doing it. Improvisation suits me. I will say that, you know, it's changed quite a bit in media art. For example, I'm very influenced by the artist Martha Rosler. I studied with Martha Rosler. I admire Martha's work tremendously. I saw a video when I was very young as a student. Perhaps, Paige, you showed this video. It's certainly in the well regarded in the history of video art. It's called Vital Statistics of a Citizen Simply Obtained, in which you see Martha Rosler standing in for this figure herself, subject to all kinds of measurement and examination. Feminist performance art was very important to me, is very important to me, the history of it. And when I was making my first video, I was trying to find an actor to play this person with AIDS. I got an actor, and I was working with that actor, and I talked to Martha, and Martha said, it's you, just stand in front of the camera. It's not Hollywood, Gregg. Which I think is really funny, because that's very much about the late 70s and early 80s, right? That, you know, it's not Hollywood. There was a very strong divide between the notion of televised and commercial film performance and art video. You know, you had Vito Acconci performing his trance-like mantras, Dara Birnbaum was enormously influential on me. Martha, Yvonne Rainer's filmmaking. So it was, I was really interested in that kind of performance where the artist places themselves in a position, in a role. I'm very interested in role play. That was amplified in the AIDS activist movements because I became a civil disobedience trainer, and I was trained in civil disobedience and then learned how to train others in performing acts of civil disobedience. And role play plays a very important role in those kinds of trainings. We were very moved and influenced by archival footage of civil rights protesters playing roles for the training sessions for the lunch counter integration protests in the South, where some protesters would pretend to be people in the cafe, and others would be protesters. They were pouring milkshakes on each other, calling each other horrible names. They were preparing for the kind of anger and violence that they would meet through their actions, preparing themselves emotionally, preparing themselves to be able to respond non-violently and that was profound. And so for us too, like when I became a civil disobedience trainer, you'd say, okay, half the room, you're cops, half the room, you're protesters. Cops arrest the protesters, all the protesters go limp. So everyone, and then you flip it. So everyone has the experience of being carried away, going limp in a nonviolent civil disobedience. And everyone has the experience of carrying someone, what it's like and how you negotiate that. And it doesn't always work, but we would train people to try to make the cop understand you're a human being, right? Like not all cops are violent. Like there can be there is this room. That resonates. I said that, and it resonates. I know we're at this historical moment where it is very urgent to recognize how much violence is perpetrated by the police force and how that violence is state sponsored. Still, I think from the point of view of an activist, it's very important to be able to navigate those power relations, specifically in protest. So the question is, improvisation is very, very important. To me, it does involve a certain set of skills, but not necessarily the ones that you think of in terms of scripted performances.
Great. So I think I just want to take a little break before we, partly out of a recognition of Zoom exhaustion, and that we have an audience, and that it's not just the three of us having tea. And so just wanted to check in because would shift gears into the specific questions from the students about works that they read. They watched Only Idiots Smile. They watched the piece Answers with Questions, episode 1, The Rock Star, which was part of a video talk show that was produced with Triple Canopy and you and friends during COVID, and is references that and is a different mode of production. And then they read some information about and interviews with you in Brooklyn Rail. We'll put all of that in the chat. But I wanted to just check in with the room if anyone has urgent questions at this moment, or if we can sort of shift towards asking Gregg about specific work and student responses. And if you do, you can unmute yourself or put it in the chat. A question. Which is when you talked about, this is from Dan Meyer, I think. Is Dan here? Is he here? Do you want to unmute yourself, or would you rather me read your question? I think.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Do you want to do you mind if we hold this to Act 4?
Oh yeah, sure. I just wasn't okay.
No. Okay, great. We'll be sure to come back to you. Okay. So if there are no, how are you two feeling? You feeling good to shift into the next sort of frame of talking about recent work? Okay. Okay, so these are questions drawn from the students under the category of Monday questions. And so this is a question about one of your performance pieces, the video Only Idiots Smile, which is available on Video Data Bank. And is it going to be part of the, so it will be available to be seen at PS1 MoMA?
Yes, yeah.
Great, okay. So this is from Hamadi. In Only Idiots Smile, you talked about your journey to figuring out your identity and masculinity training. And they write, I found it so fascinating how your story was similar to theirs. So it goes to show how much prejudice is embedded in most of our group identities. So their question is, what is the nexus for you between culture, gender, and other identities we choose for ourselves? And this is going to kind of bring in a few other people's variants of this, because people were really wanted to ask you about precisely what Martha Rossler asked you to do. How is your identity, and how do you understand your identity, and how does doing video and making artwork kind of unpack that for you? So the question was, Do you think that people today are too invested in finding their identity and not enjoying life, or finding false identities to fit into today's society? And how does this relate to the persistence of stigma around HIV/AIDS, illness, sexuality? And then big kicker on that one, what do you think art can do in response to it?
I'll try to be concise so we have more time. That's one of the downsides of improvising is I tend to I sacrifice concision for clarity, but I'll be concise. The first question about where do all of these various identities meet, it's correct that identity comes out of this notion of me, not me, which is kind of necessary to the structure of identity, but has a great a lot of consequences follow from that, in that all of that is the structure of identity. And so we have to be aware, first of all, of what the structure of identity is, in that, me, not me. And be aware how that is kind of inbuilt to the structure of regarding others, and how that can be limiting. So I follow from the notion of intersectionality, which is a term that was first coined by a legal theorist, Kimberly Crenshaw, in 1989. It's a very important and powerful notion that has actually come under some critique in the past few years, but nonetheless, I think is very useful, and I'm not alone in that. Intersectionality, it was initially posed as a set of questions by Kimberly Crenshaw in a legal journal in 1989, where she asked why and how is it that Black women who appear in court in the legal system are viewed as Black or women, but not as Black women, which led her to this idea of intersectionality, that we are many, and we are multiple selves in a singular self, and that changes according to frame and context. And if we are captured within a particular frame, like say the legal gaze, G-A-Z-E, then we are, not necessarily in control of how we represent ourselves or understand the multiplicity and nuance and complexity of our identities. So intersectionality became a very important political idea out of Crenshaw's legal research, and was very much taken up within the LGBTQ movement. In fact, when I started out my activism in the queer world, we didn't call it the queer world. It was called the lesbian and gay community, and LGBTQIA+ is a result of the notion of intersectionality. And because we realize that these communities that are marginalized along lines of sex, sexuality, and gender, which are three categories that don't necessarily align, that's what transgender theory teaches us, then intersectionality still becomes very, very important to understand how we are multiple and singular at the same time. So a lot of my performance work is about showing that multiplicity. In fact, it's also true of my video work as well, in that I kind of constellate or create a constellation of all the various definitions, identities, both that I myself identify with and those that are projected onto me that I reject, and also play within the slippages of who the audience believes I'm addressing. So I'm also really interested in this notion of the subject of address. When you feel hailed or included by what I'm saying, you might identify with me specifically when I'm occupying the position or role of a specific identity. But if I flip it in a quick instance, all of a sudden I'm not you. You don't want to be me, right? So I play with that kind of push and pull of identification in all of my work. And I do that in Only Idiots Smile as well. What can art do? Ultimately, I can't answer the other questions because I can't really answer those questions because they're for other people to answer. Like then I can't answer like what other people are doing. It's a question I can't answer. I don't know what other people are doing with their identities, or all I can say is that art renders options and pictures possibilities. So I've always believed that. That's the best that art can do. That's a lot. Art renders options and pictures possibilities. And ultimately, the goal of art can be to create constituencies that did not previously exist. So by that, I mean, you can create combinations of address that hails or invites a different group of people or groups of people that never imagined themselves sharing a common cause, but find it made visible or legible through the work of art itself. So I have to refer to a hark back to an earlier locution that I often used when I was younger, which was coalition and coalition building, which led on to the notion of intersectionality. And coalition building was very much about recognizing common stakes, empathy across divides of stigma, how to bear witness, which is an earlier form of how to be an ally. I know many people have issues with this term ally now. So then what is the next term? If one is interested in showing up as a witness and showing up and being helpful in any number of struggles. So that's what I would say art does. Art is really special, and I fight for art. I believe in art because art remains this, for me and my friends at least, it remains a laboratory or an arena of experimentation unlike any other area of my life. It's the gallery is made to pose questions. And I know that I was part of this generation who pointed out was preoccupied with the false neutrality of white walls and the false neutrality of the institutions. But at the same time, I think that the intervention into or against false neutrality has to happen in the site of where false neutrality is perpetrated. I would rather not remove myself from the institution, but rather be an upsetter. I borrow that term from Lee Scratch Perry, if anyone knows Lee Scratch Perry's work. Being an interventionist, it's called, being an upsetter, being recalcitrant, being annoying. I don't know. I excel at that.
Well, this is a good segue because people then moving from Only Idiots Smile then to the question about the rock star, the idea that it's in the exact same space, right, that you produced this video, that you in dialogue with your community, your friends, and so students ask, first off, can you tell us something about the pieces of paper on the back on the wall behind you? That was one question. And the second question was about what is it about the rock star and the prophet and the association with the artist that's, you're quoting Lee Scratch Perry, how important music is to you, musicians, and that you make a statement in that video that many of the students are wondering about is, are there no rock stars anymore? And what that means. So starting with the pictures behind you.
The pictures behind me are blow-ups of poems called debris fields that feature in my exhibitions. They are actually, these particular debris fields are poems that consist entirely of nouns and 10-syllable lines. And I actually composed them. There's 24 debris fields in this series, and they all exist in this size. This was scaling up. It's a piece of paper with scaling up to see how the vinyl would be applied to the wall, at what size, and from a distance, and could they be read, and could they be somehow, would they relate to the size of a body? I was interested in those kinds of formal questions about producing a text that relates to a body in a sculptural way. And actually they're nouns, but they're not names. So actually the debris fields is very much about memorials. And I installed them in the Art Institute in Chicago. I installed them in a way that could possibly put someone in mind of Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is a list of names of people who died, soldiers who died in the American soldiers during the Vietnam War. Now that I think that's one of the greatest public monuments, war monuments that was been produced in my lifetime. It's also been critiqued because it's only American service people's names, both men and women, and not the larger number of Vietnamese who died in that war. But still, I think if you look at the history of monumentality and memorialization, Maya Lin's brilliant sculpture, which places the face of a marble with inscribed names, no images, underground, beneath the hill. It's a brilliant set of moves, and really a very politically significant composition in relationship to the history of memorials. And so I'm interested in memorialization. These poems, I've mostly read these poems, actually. I write them really fast. Like I just try to write as many nouns as possible, but I'm slowed down because I have to count syllables. So it's 10 syllable lines. And that's very much kind of like a way that I work, is I always put a constraint. So, I can list nouns, but I have to list them in 10 syllable units of 10 syllable lines. So then it makes me have different word choices. They're associative. So they're kind of psychologically driven, in that the nouns follow along the line of a game of association. But nouns are names. So when I read them like people read names at the AIDS quilt. So I read them very slowly, one word at a time, the way you would read the name of the dead. And so that's what these are. And they will reappear in different form in my show at PS1, distributed differently and not recalling Maya Lin. I say that it possibly will recall Maya Lin because it doesn't, the piece doesn't depend on that. It's not a one-to-one relation. I don't make art in a one-to-one relation. So I'm not preoccupied with whether you get my references or not. The work has to stand on its own. The work has to be fascinating on its own, whether or not you get the reference. And that's a rule that I abide by. Rock stars. I saw those questions. Yes, of course there are rock stars. Today. In fact, I interviewed two of them in the first show. So my question is, are there rock stars? That was just, maybe it just didn't land well as a joke. I was kind of performing myself as an older person. So it was an aside. I looked off camera and I said, there was no one sitting next to me. It was on Zoom. But I looked over to the side as if someone was sitting next to me. And I said, are there rock stars still today? Like I'm clueless. This was part of the performance. This was like the character. I'm not talented. I can't do characters, but I can amplify certain facets of myself. One of them is an increasingly older Jewish man. So that was basically me doing that. Yes, of course, there are rock stars today. I don't think they're the same. Or I don't know. You can tell me. Anyone wants to come off mic and tell me about how you relate to rock stars, your rock stars, who are your rock stars? For me, I come from a different time when there were vinyl records and we worshiped them, and they were, and we didn't stream music. And we read the liner notes, and, I'm on Spotify. I live in the same time zone you do. I live in now. So, I don't even own records anymore. I listen to Spotify and Tidal like you do, or other platforms, SoundCloud. I listen to contemporary music. But I come from a time when the rock star was, for me and a lot of people of my group, my cohort, was one model of being, right? It was, for better or worse, right? It was a romantic idea of like being a rock star, which was in some ways hell bent on self-destruction, flirted with a kind of romantic notion of danger, kind of like Keats, like a romantic poet. And I don't know if rock stars have that today or not. Like I don't relate, like I can tap into it. I can remember how in love I was with Lou Reed, but I don't have that same love anymore. I think it's for another performer. I think it's just because I'm older, I suspect. Like I fell in love with Lou Reed when I was 16. I never met him. Actually, I did, but much later. But when I was 16 in the boroughs, this was like a fantasy. Do people still have fantasies about rock stars today? You'd have to tell me. I listen to contemporary music, and then, when the going gets tough or it's late at night, I listen to music. Like I spent the other night listening to the Isley Brothers the entire night. I love the Isley Brothers.
I think it's interesting too, though, about that the model of the punk, rock star or the alternative, right, was a model for an artist, right, working in a studio or not in a studio, or where in these kinds of, as a cultural producer. But now musicians didn't necessarily call themselves artists in the way that they do now. And yet that it's just an interesting question about the model of the, why it was so important for you in your work that the rock star was a model of an artist for you, right? Or a prophet, or something in that pantheon.
I'll venture just that it was a generational thing. I'm not sure. Like that, lots of people were in bands. My period of music is defined by people who dropped out of art school to be in bands, like the Talking Heads, for example. Famously, were all in art school. One of my favorite groups, which really dates me, is Roxy Music. And Roxy Music, they were all artists or went to art school. And there was a certain moment where it felt like making rock music was more relevant than necessarily making visual work, or it went hand in hand. Like the artists who became musicians were very deeply interested in visuality as well, and performance. Famously, glam rock is really about being self-conscious. You don't show up on stage in like jeans and a t-shirt in a stadium. Why would you do that? That's totally unnatural. There's no such thing. It's not natural to show up in front of an audience of thousands of people in jeans and a t-shirt. No, you dress fabulous. You look fabulous. So that's like kind of the generation. It's generational. I can't speak for anyone who hasn't gone through my experiences. And it's very different now. And it's very different, especially during COVID. And I haven't been to see music. I do go see music, and I haven't been seeing a lot of music, and I haven't been able to read during COVID. It's been very hard for me to concentrate reading. So I had these huge listening sessions where I listened to whole albums again, which I haven't done in a while. The album used to have integrity as an object. That was the thing about the vinyl, really, was that, I think like Marvin Gaye's What's Going On is like the most important concept album in the history of recorded music. That's just me. That's just my generation. Like forget Sgt. Pepper's, forget Dark Side of the Moon. What's Going On is like the most important concept album. But the whole notion of the concept of the album has changed completely. You don't get out of it. That's not a unit anymore, right? So that's the same thing with the rock star. The rock star is not a unit anymore. Yes, there are these people that are commercially pushed forward. There are these very talented people. I think a lot of my work and the work of my peers was also deeply influenced by hip hop and media art. Hip hop influenced media art directly because I was very interested in scratch aesthetics, glitches, using the equivalent of using turntables as musical instruments, using cameras as instruments. So music was very important to me. I think, I don't know, here I draw a blank. Like when I talk, I'll be totally honest, when I talk to people who are younger than me, it seems to me, and I don't want to make any blanket statements, but when I talk to my younger friends, they don't seem to have the same, and maybe this is good, the same, and this is just limited to my own anecdotal experience, they don't seem to have the same kind of obsessive relationship of the fan to the star. And maybe this is a good thing. And Mike Kelly was in a band called Kill All Rock Stars, right? That was for a reason, right? That notion, the whole notion of like taking these people off the pedestal, right? And I was really interested in local music. Like for me, punk was really my period, and no wave, which followed punk and post-punk. And that was very local. That was like about local bands, and hip hop was also like a lot about that too. It wasn't about mega commerciality. I'm not against it. You know, I love Jay-Z. You know, I listen to, what to say? You know, I'm very eclectic. I like to say yes to most things if they're not going to hurt me. You know, I like aesthetically, I just like to be open as I possibly can. And actually, I studied with an artist named Will Anastasi, who was a great artist and a great teacher. And when I was like 18, he said, Greg, you have to be like a sponge, taking things in, and a laser, putting things out. That always stuck in my head.
Wow.
And mobility was very important, like class. Class definitely played a role in me being an artist. I don't have a college degree. Actually, my terminal degree is a high school diploma. I sat in on a lot of college classes, but I dropped out to be an activist. I'm not saying you should. It just didn't, the degree didn't make sense in the late 80s for me because I really only thought I had a few years to live. So college, you know, at that time, but, you know, I teach. That's perhaps why I never left school. You know, I'm a full professor with tenure and middle class, right? You know, so, but this notion of mobility, like art was this arena in which there was some mobility. There was always racism and sexism, and there still is. And many of us are working on that within the field or multiple fields. But there was also a kind of mobility in the art world, at least among artists, where that was not afforded in other career paths. And I don't know, you can tell me if you experienced that, you or, you know, the people in the class, you know, it would be interested if, you know, if you feel that about going into that as a young artist. For me, going into art as a young artist was a way to achieve a kind of mobility that I saw foreclosed in other career paths.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question. So it's 7:30, so we have definitely passed the Zoom exhaustion point for all of us. But I do want to invite, see if there's if Greg, we can do another 5 minutes for one question. And,
more than 5. I'm fine.
Okay, you're not Zoom exhausted yet?
No.
Not yet? Okay. So why don't we take a few questions, and now I will introduce the role of both students and audience, but also Cortland Bird, who is our teaching assistant, who is a USC film school dropout, She wanted me to say that, and a PhD candidate in the Department of Media Study, but works across video and I can't find her bio. So she will now be in charge of the chat and of taking questions from students. So if you have any questions for Gregg, we can unmute yourself, raise your hand, but Cortland will be in charge, and I'll find her bio as we.
Well, I think we can return to Dan's question from earlier, just to start off as other people develop their own. So I'll just read it from the chat. When you talked about the greater chances of a given piece, let's say as you did a painting, being seen more in a network digital medium, I started wondering about the meaning of recognition to an artist. How should an artist interpret recognition? While much of the globe is connected through this shared space, continuously interacting and contributing to it, how does it change the mechanics of recognition or the nature of an audience as a whole?
It's a great question, and audiences, like frames, exist on many levels and in many different shapes and sizes. So for me, recognition is really important from my peers. It's still very much like personal, but I also enjoy critical recognition, like being asked to do a retrospective. I feel very fortunate. I'm not on Instagram or Facebook, but I know many artists who are, and I think that that's a really great medium as well. I think the likes are real. I think they're very different than getting recognition in a kind of long form. But I think also when you talk about recognition, you're really raising the question about how you feel about yourself as well. And I often tell students not to confuse recognition with love. It's very important, actually. So if you do something that's really well acclaimed, actually, it's likely that you might confuse that with love, because part of being a human, but also part of being an artist, is seeking a certain amount of approval and recognition. And it's important not to interpret that as love, because if you get negative criticism, you're also likely to interpret that and feel that as hate. And it's neither. I believe that I'm kind of relatively anonymous in the process. Like I said before, I protect myself because I do very autobiographical work. I don't really reveal anything that I'm not ready to discuss publicly. And I'm only confident that it's worth discussing publicly because I believe that that aspect of myself is shared by many. And so that is why I'm motivated to share that. But I also have to prepare for that. There's a lot of different feelings that are going to come my way by a lot of different people, because I'm always talking about the fractured and multiple nature of my identity. And that does make some people happy and other people really angry at me. So I can't interpret it as personal in that way, or I have to kind of be aside. I'm not my work. And I'm constantly explaining that because I am in my work. So people view me as my work. Even the museum, like we had this discussion, about like what images represent my work. And there was a lot of images that showed me, but I said, well, actually that's not me and my work. That's like a snapshot of me at a protest. That's not my work. That's someone took that picture of me. It's a really nice picture. I kind of like the way I look in that, but that's not my work. And so that's really kind of important to me in terms of how I think of recognition. I also, yeah, I think that one should be prepared for all kinds of recognition, which are negative and positive, and indifference. Sometimes indifference is the thing that hurts the most, not recognition. So you have to be, one can be. I want to be very careful because I don't want to prescribe anything. But what's worked for me is being very thoughtful about where I end and the work starts, and I understand most of my work as a set of premises that either obtain or fail, but the failures can be successes, and the works that obtain are not necessarily the ones I'm most, at the end of the day, most proud of. If that makes sense. Does that make sense to you, at least, Cortland?
It makes sense. Yeah. Thank you. Other questions? Feel free to unmute or write it in the chat.
Greg, you may not have Zoom fatigue, but our audience might at this point.
Yeah, that's fine. It's my job to be. It's my job to be here because you have invited me here, and I want to be a good guest and honor your interests, by which I am very gratified and honored. But if we are all tired, I can call it a day.
Is that Alyssa? Are you?
Yeah, I was just if everyone is okay with going on just a little bit longer, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that kind of sense of being overdetermined. What I'm thinking about is how a lot of times when not even just socially engaged art, but artists who are perceived as always already kind of being activists. If you are a LGBTQ artist, your art is activism. You're here to change hearts and minds. You're here to educate people. I was just wondering if, as a kind of final, maybe, I don't know what else is going to happen today, thought, just if you could speak to that feeling of kind of being overdetermined or being perceived before you arrive as playing a specific role.
That's an excellent question. That is an excellent question. And my solution in my work was to burden the overdetermination. So I actually try to identify so many things to the point that the structure of the self collapses. That's my notion of identity politics, actually, is not speaking from any specific minoritarian position, but rather letting so many minoritarian positions attach to me that I'm hoping for kind of productive confusion. And when I teach, I very much am attuned to this because of my own experiences. But when I teach, we talk about I have conversations with my faculty about how different faculty are burdened according to how they appear. So whenever the issue of race or racism comes up, people of color in the room, white people turn to people of color in the room as if people of color have the answer. And I remember one summer I teach in a summer program, and marriage equality came up, and you could see everyone in the room was looking around to see who was visibly queer, like to answer the question. And it's the same thing. Like the stigmatized subject or the minoritarian subject is always burdened with having the answer. So how do we resist this? How do we get other people to do the necessary work? And my solution was to just, in some ways, just as I described, just like, that's how you see me, okay, that's how you see me, okay, that's how you see me, okay. And actually then the contradictions you accumulate so many positions that the contradictions really kind of fall away. Now, I think that has to do, that raises the issue of like code switching and passing, and also the context in which you find yourself. All those are really complicated. I'm really interested in code switching. I've been doing it since I was a kid, along all axes of my identity. Perhaps I was prepared for this kind of work in that way. Passing, I don't know, there's some, I appear in some ways where people don't have questions, or they make assumptions about my identity that aren't really consistent with the way I understand myself in the world. At the same time, identities are projected onto me. So you ask a very complicated question, and I think that the way to resist overdetermination is to reflect it back at the forces that are perpetrating it.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic insight. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent question.
One more. Anyone else have a pressing question? Liz, do you have a question that you want to end with or ask Gregg? You want to talk a little bit about I also just want to give you a chance to talk about the project in the fall.
Well, I'm just reflecting on some of the echoes within Gregg's answers, many answers and questions, and the sense of exhaustion and the sense of overburdening your identity. I mean, I feel like they are kind of kindred spirit in terms of how you approach a potential problem or a question or an inquiry. Say yes to everything and then begin to say no. I'm seeing your methodology take different forms, and I love that because the forms speak so much to how you are thinking about everything and approaching everything for what they are, and not trying to collapse or force your methodology onto it, but really finding a beautiful way to bring out like the aspects of the form that you're interested in. So yeah, if I may say something about the exhibition that we have coming up in the fall. So Gregg is like he was saying, he was writing every day. He's making drawings every day because we are going to be showing new work by Gregg starting in November, early November at UB Anderson Gallery. And we have yet to figure out exactly what it's going to look like, but it will be a process of saying yes to a lot of things and then no to a lot of things. And then we'll figure out what it is.
That's right. Thank you, Liz, for what you said before. That was very kind. And I'm really excited by your invitation. I'm excited to work with you, and your invitation gives me an opportunity to explore new work. I'll be making new work post the retrospective, which is very exciting to me, which will be drawings and sculptures and maybe textiles. I'm not quite sure. So I'm very excited. I'm very eager to, it'll be nice to come and visit because I think that will be possible in the fall. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Great. Well, thank you both. This has been an amazing conversation, and thank you for your generosity, Gregg and Liz, both, and for our audience and questions, and their questions, and our students, and to Cortland. So I'm going to end our recording, and thank you again, Gregg. This has really been fantastic.
Thank you so much, Paige. It's great to still be in conversation, and I'm really honored that you asked me to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paige. And thank you, Cortland.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Cortland.